Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first community meeting for the Town of Winchester North Main Street study. And this evening, March 2nd, 2021. My name is Josh Fiala. I'm a principal planner at MAPC. We're here this evening to discuss the North Main Street corridor in Winchester from about the intersection of Skillings Road to the Woburn City line. Before we get too far along, we'd just like to make sure that all participants are aware this meeting is being recorded. A recording will be posted on the town website for other participants to view after this evening. If you do not feel comfortable being recorded, please turn off your camera and stay muted throughout the meeting. Otherwise, we're considering your video and participation consent to be a part of the meeting. So we just have a few helpful Zoom reminders as we get rolling. So the meeting is being recorded, as I just mentioned. We ask that participants stay muted. We will have some portions of the meeting for questions, comments, and some discussion. So we'll unmute people during those times. But during the presentation portions, we suggest that you remain muted to avoid any audio issues. During the comment and question periods, you can use the raise your hand function, which should be available in your Zoom options. If you don't see that option, you can turn your video on and literally raise your hand, and we'll try to take a look in the squares of the videos to make sure that we recognize people. And then you can also use the chat, which is available to you to raise questions or post comments throughout our program this evening. And if it's available and you're comfortable with it, we'd love to have you turn your video on, just see who's out there, see whether you're smiling or grimacing as we go through this effort. So it just helps to feel that we're actually speaking to the community rather than the black box out there. So we appreciate that. So we'd like to get started with a few introductions and welcome. We'll tell you a little bit more about who we are. But first, I'd like to hand it over to Planning Board Chair Heather Von Meering for a brief welcome from the town.
Thank you. Thank you to all the members of the Winchester community who are joining us this evening to take on the first phase of public feedback for the Main Street study. As noted, I am Heather Von Meering. I am chair of the Planning Board. Along with me this evening is Dieb Jurius. He is the vice chair and secretary of the Planning Board as required per Mass law. We have Maureen Meister, Heather Hannon, and Cheryl Wolf, all members of the Planning Board with us. If you ever want to reach one of us, you can reach all of us by emailing at planningboard@winchester.us. We all receive those emails. In addition, with us this evening is Brian Zacchelli. He is our town planner. And if you have any questions, please feel free to also reach out to him as well. He's a wonderful asset and resource for the Planning Board, but also for the town and for the residents. So please reach out to him if you ever have any questions. Today, we are here to look at the North Main Street area, the area that many of us refer to on the other side of Stop and Shop or Town Pantry, also known as the White Hen, all the way up the North Main Street towards the Woburn line. We received $30,000 appropriation from town meeting to take this on, and in response, we have contracted with the regional planning organization, MAPC, and are excited to work with Josh Fiala, who is here and who was just speaking. His background is in architecture and planning, and we feel he's an excellent fit for this exciting visionary study. We look forward to the public's input in this process and seeing what visioning the town has for this area. Thank you so much for all your participation. We really look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you, Heather. And welcome again, everyone. So the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, as Heather just mentioned, is the regional planning agency for the Boston metropolitan area, and that includes Winchester. We assist municipalities throughout the region with technical planning studies such as this one. Our team in this case includes myself, and Heather described my background a little bit, thankfully, so that's great. And we also have Yolando Spinola on this meeting, who's one of our community engagement specialists. Some of you might have heard from Yolando as we've been reaching out and trying to get in touch with stakeholders of the North Main Street area. So Yolando's working with us. We also have a land use intern who's been hard at work producing some of the analyses that you'll see this evening, Russell Wong. So we're happy to have our team working with you all and if you're not familiar with MAPC, you can take a look at our website, mapc.org, and take a look at the breadth of work that we do in service of our 101 cities and towns. So tonight we're going to introduce what the study is about, provide some analysis to help us understand and think about North Main Street in the context of this study, and work with you all to define a vision for North Main Street. We'll close with a brief outline of the next steps for this process and keep you informed of how you can stay a part of it as we move along. In our first Zoom poll of the evening, so one of the ways that we're engaging in this meeting, since we're not together physically, is through some Zoom polls. So hopefully you've maybe used these before. If not, they're pretty straightforward. A Zoom poll will pop up on your screen when I initiate it in a few minutes. And then you can respond to those and submit your answer, and then we'll be able to see the results and share them back with you all. So the first is a little bit of a test just to get us rolling, but it's a simple one. And it's basically asking you to tell us about yourself. So we've introduced you to the team and who's involved on the town side of things. What we'd like to hear is what you consider your primary relationship to North Main Street. So let me launch that poll for you now. So that should be on your screen now. And if you just click on one of the options that best fit your relationship to North Main Street. So whether you're a resident directly on North Main Street, a resident on an abutting side street, a resident of the area in general, a resident of the town, even further afield, a business owner on North Main Street, a property owner on North Main Street, a patron or visitor to North Main Street, or a town meeting member. And a town board, committee, or staff member, if that's your preference to choose that, and other. So you only have the option to choose one. So whichever one you feel most strongly your affiliation is, you can choose that one. And I'm sure there's other affiliations too, but we only get to populate 10 answers, part of the Zoom constraints here. So it looks like we have many people have voted, but if you could get a chance, that would be great. We have 30 of 39 participating presently. Just give it a few more seconds. All right, looks like that's all we're going to get. So let me end the poll, and I can share it back to you, and hopefully you should be able to see those results. So that's the results I see are 32% identifying the largest group as residents on an abutting side street. Looks like the next largest categories are just in general a resident of the town at 16%, or a property owner at 16%, then a town meeting member at 13%. Then you can see some of the other percentages. So thank you for doing that and participating that way. It's helpful to know who's out there and who's a part of our event this evening. And it's good to see a good cross-section and distribution across those categories. So let's get into what this meeting is about and what the study is about. So let's start here with the master plan. So the town of Winchester recently completed an award-winning town-wide master plan. This plan looked at the entire town and identified actions to be undertaken over the next 10 years to help guide the town toward your shared vision of the future. One of those overall action areas was defined as balancing development with preservation. Specifically, Goal A1 states, encourage more commercial mixed use and compact development in areas that support economic vibrancy, including strategic development parcels in the town center and identified evolving opportunity areas. So North Main Street area that we're talking about specifically here is an evolving opportunity area. So in this, on the page, what you see is actually strategy A1.2.1 of the master plan. And that's to create an area plan for the North Main Street corridor to envision public realm improvements and to identify development opportunities, zoning amendments, and design guidelines to help shape future development. The details mentioned point toward physical improvements, less restrictive zoning with development incentives, increased housing choice, increased commercial and jobs base, and mixed-use residential. And that all of these options should be grounded in a community-led process. So this tonight is a part of that process. Here's a diagram from the master plan that shows the areas of North Main Street. The evolving opportunity area is that with the red tone on it, the red gradation. So this study is really a continuation of the town's proactive planning and an implementation action of the master plan. The overall objectives are to develop a vision for North Main Street that can help to define zoning recommendations, design guidelines, and public realm improvements. Our scope and work plan is designed to enable us to meet these objectives through a process that is driven by data and analysis and combined with robust community input. So this evening is a part of that gathering of input. We've also been working to develop stakeholder interviews along the way as well, which I'll touch on in a moment. The process is designed to provide recommendations to the planning board in about the month of June, with 2 community meetings to get us from there to here, or from here to there, including this evening's meeting, and a second meeting, which will be towards the end of April or the beginning of May. We're coordinating with the planning board along the way, and the planning board will be the body to advance recommendations from this process, such as taking zoning recommendations to town meeting. As I mentioned, as part of this process, we're reaching out to discuss North Main Street with stakeholders individually or in small groups. If you'd like to speak with us in that setting, or have a suggestion of someone who we should reach out to, we'd be all ears. And we'd love it if you could send Yolando an email at the email address on the screen. Maybe Yolando can also put his email in the chat for us too, so you can have that easily clickable link. So we've been working on those. We'll be continuing to work on those over the next couple months, and are happy to speak with anyone that would like to share those perspectives with us in a more one-on-one setting. Our study area is defined by the zoning map of Winchester. So you can see that official map on the screen. And of course, the area that we're focused on is that boxed in with the yellow rectangle there. Here's a zoom in of that area. We're focused on the General Business District 2 and General Business District 3 properties along North Main Street, which total 76 parcels. You can see those in the red and the orange. GBD 2, General Business District 2, is the southern half of North Main Street between Skillings Road and Swanton Street. You see an aerial of that portion of the street. GBD 3 is the northern half of North Main Street from about Swanton Street to the Woburn City line. And here's an aerial of that portion of the street as well. So we're going to have a series of slides after this that go into some more detailed analysis of those parcels in the area of the study. But before we do, we just thought we'd pause and ask if anyone has any questions in general about the study, the basics of which we just outlined for you. So again, the options here, if you do want to ask a question, you can put it into the chat, type it in, or you could use the raise your hand function, or you can literally raise your hand on the screen and we will unmute folks and ask them to ask the question. I will pause for just one moment longer to let any of those functions happen, but at this moment seeing none. All right, well, there will be plenty of time to ask questions as we move along as well. So I'll just keep on rolling. So I'd like to present some of the analysis of North Main Street to help us better understand what is there today and kind of give us a solid footing in terms of the types of data that we're looking at. We'll start off pretty general and then get more detailed in this next series of slides. So first are just some street view shots that show the street character, an eclectic mix of uses and buildings that you all probably know very well. This is the northern side of Main Street, up near the Woburn City line. And then moving down south toward the intersection with Swanton Street. And down south further still, all the way down to Skillings Road in that intersection. Based on review of some of the past planning studies and documents, these are the types of improvements that have been contemplated on North Main Street. So adding vitality to the commercial corridor with additional restaurant or retail uses, specifically mixing residential uses into the corridor above the ground floor, potentially adding affordable housing units that could count towards the town's subsidized housing inventory, retaining the character of the corridor, preserving key buildings and overall development patterns, and improving pedestrian safety and walkability. So before we go too deep into the analysis, we'd love to get some additional perspectives from you all about what you would describe as your vision for North Main Street. So I have a second poll which will help with that. And it's broken down into a few different components. So I have 3 questions as a part of this poll. Let me launch that poll now and I'll walk you through it. So you should see that poll up on the screen now. The 3 questions are, what is the most important aspect of North Main Street? And we've listed a few options there, and you're able to choose one of those options. The second question is, how close is North Main Street today compared to what you'd like it to be? And you can choose one of those options, which are a gradation of from very close to not close at all. And then the last of those 3 questions is, what is missing from North Main Street? And that's a multiple choice. You can put in multiple answers for that. So any of those that you think feel are missing, you can select. So give people a couple minutes to complete that. For those watching the video at home, I'll say at this moment too, Yolando and I have prepared a companion Qualtrics survey, which is an online survey, which has these same questions in them. And so we'll, when the video of this presentation is posted online on the town's website, we'll also make sure the link for that poll is posted along with it. And so other members of the community who are viewing this after the live presentation this evening can actually take and respond to these same questions through that poll. And we'll review and receive those as well. So it does look like we also have a hand raised at this point. So maybe Russell, with your iPad, I will ask you to unmute, and then you can do that and ask a question.
Thank you, Josh. I just had a question regarding the reinvestment and renovation of the North Main Street corridor. Will Winchester be hiring architecture, urban design, or urban planning and landscape architecture firms?
For what aspect of the work?
All aspects. So, well, landscape architecture, maybe not on the forefront, but urban planning and also architectural firms. In other words, if there are builders or slash developers who will be involved in the renovation and reinvestment of the North Main Street corridor, will they be consulting with architecture firms, urban plannings, and landscape architectural firms?
Okay, I think let me just try to answer that, and I'll see if I understood that correctly. So we are in our planning agency, MAPC. We do have myself included, architects and urban designers. And so we're providing some of that expertise to the town in this planning study, which will frame some recommendations regarding the regulations of the corridor, so zoning and design guidelines, and framing some other improvements which might occur in the corridor. But then there will be other aspects to the improvements of the corridor, which will involve private investments, private developers, and they will also be hiring, I would imagine, their own architects, urban designers, or landscape architects as part of their consultant teams to do the work on their specific projects. So we're framing through our expertise sort of the front end of those longer term development processes and improvement processes through the regulatory environment, which our recommendations are pointed towards the town. So the types of changes that the town can make through its own regulations to set the stage for potential improvements, many of which will be through private investments as the corridor evolves over time. Some of them would also be potentially through public investments in the street or streetscape. And then those will also would have an additional design process, which may involve civil engineers, landscape architects, or others. So hopefully that answers or gets at the overall question that you posed.
Thank you.
No problem. So that's given us time to, looks like, get most of the responses to this poll in. So I'll end this poll and share those results quickly with you. So it looks like we had 32 people join us in the voting on this visioning poll. So the most important aspect of North Main Street people voted on was that it supports small businesses and economic activity. And that got 34% of the vote, followed by it has a variety of activities that work well together, and that's 22%. Moving on to the second question. So how close is North Main Street today compared to what you would like it to be? In the majority, 66% responded not close. It could benefit from substantial changes. So that helps us a lot to actually understand the order of magnitude of the types of changes that we might be considering as part of this process. And then the third question, what is missing from North Main Street? And people could select multiple answers for this response. More street trees and landscaping was tied with safer walking and biking, followed by more housing and additional small businesses and services. So thank you for those results. And again, we'll have a parallel poll, which is available to others to help fill in our understanding of where people stand on those questions. All right, so now we're going to get into a little more detailed analysis on the corridor to help us all understand what's out there today. So the diagram on the screen, just to orient you to it, because this is a diagram that we're going to be using for the next few analyses. So on the left side of your screen is oriented toward the City of Woburn line. Down as it slants down to the bottom right side of the screen, it is the intersection of Skillings Road and Main Street. And the main street along the middle is Main Street. We do have the roads labeled on the following slides, so that should be a little more helpful. But on this slide, what we're seeing are the GBD2 and GBD3 zoning districts and the parcels that are included in them, and some general characteristics about the parcels. So they're both, in terms of planning studies that we do around the region, I would characterize these as both relatively modest areas in terms of the overall acreage, the total acreage of the districts. It's not a huge amount of land, but it is a critical amount of land for the town of Winchester for sure. GBD3 is slightly larger overall and has slightly larger parcels on average, just under a ½ acre in size on average. And then GBD2 is just under a ½ acre in size on average for the parcels. GBD2 has slightly more owner-occupied properties. And that's I'll explain our approach to owner-occupied properties in a few slides. And then it does have more buildings and it has more assessed value, probably connected to the fact that it has more buildings. So here's a similar diagram. You can see the street names on this one. So Main Street's in the middle, flowing from the bottom or the top left from the Woburn line down to the bottom right to Skilling's Road. This is a diagram that shows the land use in the corridor. Yellow is residential. Those parcels are distributed throughout the corridor. You can see them, not concentrated in any one area. Commercial is red and is the most consistent color across Main Street. Pink is mixed use, so more than one use is typically residential and commercial on the same property. Blue is a utility property, and gray are vacant, so no buildings on the gray. And you can see those same uses arranged by percentage of land totaling in the parcels we're looking at. Commercial properties are the dominant parcel or the dominant use with 60% of the total uses, followed by residential at 16%. One of the things that's helpful to consider about the real estate economic development and evolution of corridors like this is to think about the relationship of the building value to the land value, just as an approximation of how much investment has occurred on a particular property. So those properties which are colored in green on this diagram have a land value which is higher than the building value, meaning that the land which the building is sitting on is worth more. The properties shown in red here have a building which is more valuable than the land. So typically a larger building, a building which is perhaps newer or consists of a more substantial investment. So those are just interesting aspects of the corridor. And this is all based upon the town's assessor's data. Another interesting aspect of the corridor is to look at the year built data. So this diagram is a gradation of year built. The darker tones of blue are the more recent the building was built. The variety of old and new buildings is pretty evenly distributed along North Main Street, giving the street its unique eclectic feel, I think in part. That's one of the things contributing to it. The largest share of year built dates ranges from the 1969 to 1940 category, with 30% of the properties within that category. So that's the others are in one of the other categories. And if you take that 1969 to 1940 range, which actually is in the middle of our ranges there, the other percentages of properties are actually pretty evenly distributed, newer and older, if you use that range as the midpoint. There's also been, of those older properties that were just highlighted, about 27 of those properties along North Main Street, those shown in blue on the screen now, have been inventoried as a historic asset in the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System, or MACRIS for short. One property not in our study area, but directly on North Main Street at the corner of Russell Road is on the National Register. That property is shown in red, but it's not in the GBD3 zoning district. Building height is shown on the screen now. So the darker the orange or brown tone, the taller the building is. Building height ranges from 1 to 3 stories on the North Main Street corridor today. A few taller buildings are located further north along the street. The most prominent height on the North Main Street corridor today is 2.5 stories. So that's the height which shows up most frequently. And that's about 28% of the buildings on North Main Street are 2.5 stories today. And then 24% are 1 story and 20% are 3 story. And then density is another interesting land use characteristic that we're taking a look at. So density measures how much building development is on a given property. The darker pink tone in this case is more dense. So the density measure that we're depicting is called floor area ratio, FAR. And the floor area ratio is a measurement of the total building area divided by the total land area of a property. And that gives you a density of that area. The most prominent density range that shows up in the North Main Street area today is from 0.5 FAR to 0.1 FAR, which is, I would consider that a relatively low FAR for a commercial corridor of this nature. But not, relative to more auto-oriented places which have smaller buildings and larger parking lots, it's about average, about normal for that type of development. So that category of 0.5 to 0.1 represents 75% of the properties that we're studying here in the North Main Street corridor. And then looking at the parking relative to that density. So typically, the more parking that's provided, the less building area that is provided. It's a relationship between the two. And so the coloring here shows the darker red are properties with more parking. So 50 plus more spaces. The medical office building up towards the north end is the most parked property, has the most parking spaces. And then you can see the ranges of parking throughout the corridor. And this diagram shows the properties that are more likely than not to be owner occupied based upon the assessor's data. And this is a quick look. It may not be totally accurate, but it basically compares the address of the property to the owner's mailing address as listed with the assessor's data. So if those two match, then we consider that pretty clearly an owner occupied property, is what you see in green. And then if that mailing address to property address does not match, then we've colored it the pink tone, which may indicate that, not in all cases, but it may indicate that the owner does not occupy that property, but is an owner either in another city or town in Massachusetts or another state altogether, and is renting the property to another user. And in some cases, it might just be the fact that the owner does occupy the property, but has their mail sent to some other building for another reason. And that was about, so that calculation showed about 15% of the properties are owner occupied properties. So many of the previous analyses are inputs into this final diagram that shows an approximation of the potential for change on properties on North Main Street. This is not a diagram necessarily showing what should change, but rather what is more or less likely to change based upon building and property characteristics. It's not a perfect science, but it does give an indication of the amount of opportunity in the corridor. This shows a pretty even split amongst those three categories, but I would actually say that this compilation of these characteristics shows a decent amount of opportunity in the North Main Street corridor for some change or evolution. About 29% of the land area is categorized as a near-term redevelopment opportunity. So those would be potentially the opportunity, the buildings which are less valuable than their land. They are smaller, less dense, and perhaps older. So those are the properties in green. The properties in yellow are longer term potential redevelopment opportunities, and that's about 41% of the land by total land area in the corridor. And those are properties which similarly have lower ratios of the building value to the land value. They may be less dense buildings or one-story buildings, but they may have a use which is less likely to change. For example, a bank or a franchise of some kind. And those are typically kind of set up and have their real estate needs worked out and may not be looking for a redevelopment type change. And then those properties which are showing up as red, where change is unlikely, represent about 30% of the property in North Main Street corridor. And the unlikely are those which have seen redevelopment recently or new investment recently, or are have a high building value relative to the land value. It's not to say that they can't change. They may have a proposal that's waiting in the wings that we don't know about yet. That is there, but just from what we can see of these characteristics, we would classify it that way. Again, this isn't a perfect science. Don't take this as a Bible, but it's an indication to help us think about the evolution of corridors and how economic redevelopment and real estate redevelopment occurs. So just wrapping up this round of analyses, and then we'll have some more interaction with each other. The North Main Street walkability, I would say is decent. So there are, it's only a mile end to end, which isn't that far to walk. So 10 minutes to get to about the midpoint at Bellino Park. There is a park there, which is nice, an asset for pedestrians. And then another 10 minutes to get down to the other end and get to Elliott Park. There are connections for bikes on the newly completed Tri-Community Greenway, which just comes near the study area here. And overall, the walk score, if I can find it here in my notes. The walk score, the area which measured walkability and the ability to get to destinations safely on foot, is a 64 today, which includes somewhat walkable based upon that metric, meaning some errands can be accomplished on foot. So walkability isn't too bad today. There are sidewalks on both sides of Main Street today, and then the bicycle lane on the Greenway. And there are crosswalks which don't occur at every intersection, but do occur at regular intervals. There's potentially some room for improvement there, but there are marked crosswalks present along the entire length of North Main Street. Then the last thing to mention in terms of walkability and pedestrian safety are curb cuts. You can see it's a little hard to see on the screen, but they're in yellow. The curb cuts have been marked, and there's some areas where frequent and wide curb cuts do show up. And those are highlighted with the red tones there. So every time a curb is broken by a driveway, a parking lot, or access road, it creates a potential for conflict between cars and people, or bikes and people. So curb cuts are something to look at and understand the width of the dimensions and frequency. So I'll pause there. That was a lot of analyses and information that we just went through pretty quickly. So I'll just see, I probably have missed some comments or questions in the chat, or also if people would like to raise a hand, which you can do if you have the Zoom controls, which are typically on the bottom of your screen. you can open your chat window, and then through the chat window, I believe you can raise your hand, or is it through the participants window?
Yep.
Yeah, through the participants window, if you open that option up, you can use the option under more. I think it probably shows up to raise your hand, or it might just be there for you as the participants. So Yolanda, do you see any questions that I should refer to that have come up?
There is one question from Sherry. Does the concept of walkability include no shade given the hotter weather?
Yeah, so walkability does relate to the landscape for sure, and street trees and shade trees. And I didn't get a chance yet to look, but we can pull up some data MAPC has relative to the heat island effect. And that's where effectively you're looking at the amount of sun absorption that occurs in areas that have a high amount of pavement, and they have elevated temperatures relative to their surrounding areas, which are more green. I would guess you might see some elevated temperatures on the North Main Street corridor, given the characteristics we just walked through. But we could take a look at that, and street trees would add to the comfort, or other shading devices would add to the comfort of pedestrians, particularly in the summer months. I see also a question about any traffic analysis. Unfortunately, in this case, we don't have much by the way of traffic analysis in our scope. But we are happy to hear about traffic concerns or issues that people have been experiencing on the corridor, and see what kind of thoughts or expertise we could lend to that. But typically, in processes such as this one, oftentimes the specific traffic considerations are I guess interrogated at a time when there is a specific development project, which is being contemplated. And it's difficult to understand in a more broad and general way what those specific traffic impacts might be. So that's one comment I would add there. Others, anyone else want to? I don't see any hands at this point. Other hand
just popped up by
Sherry. Yes. Let us see if we can unmute you.
I just asked her to unmute.
Yeah, I'm curious as to, so North Main Street is, regardless of whether there's new development along it, it is an entry corridor into Winchester for a lot of traffic just passing through Winchester, and that's not likely to change. So I would expect that to, knowing just the current level of traffic, should play a major part into what can be expected as to the livability along Main Street.
That's a great point. We'll see what we can find by way of existing data in terms of traffic counts on the street today. But that is an excellent point. It's a gateway and thoroughfare into the city, and it will remain as such.
And there is a question around the park areas, if there's any improvement plans for the two park areas along the route.
I might not be best positioned to answer that, but I have not heard of any specific improvements in what we've learned so far. It's not to say that there aren't plans afoot, but I guess maybe I would turn that turn that question around a little bit and say, are there specific park improvements that you would like to see at the parks that we should know about? And if so, sort of what are the nature of those improvements, or how are those parks lacking in how they're servicing the community? Because that's something we would like to know and integrate into our thinking for this study.
Just to say quickly, there's no specific plans, but there are certainly residents that are interested in doing expanding those parks, not necessarily the space, but the amount of options that you can do in this for passive recreation. I don't know who asked that one question. I just wanted to say that there's no known plans that are out for those parks at this time, but there is interest.
Thanks, Brian, for clarifying that. So I'll give one last call for questions at this moment. You'll get another chance. We have one more section of this presentation to get through. All right, seeing none, we will keep moving along. Thank you for those. That's very helpful. And I'm glad to see people are engaging with us. It's never that great when people are just sitting blank staring us. All right, so the last question before we move on to the next section is another Zoom poll. So given everything we just went through, I would just like to see and have you reflect on what you thought the most important component of all of those analyses were. So let me bring that up. And this is another one where you just get to choose the one option. So we're making you really prioritize here. So it just lists the analyses which we just went through. So land use, building to land value, year built, historical survey, the building height, density, parking, or owner occupied. So I'm not sure if people have an opinion about that. There may not be. Looks like we're getting some votes in. So it looks like about half of the participants have voted. Give it just a couple seconds more. Right, we're up to 65%, which looks pretty good. All right, so let me share those results back to you and I'll explain them. So it looks like potential change was the viewed as most important, which I would think that's an important one as well. 44% of you thought that. And then the next was a series of ties. So we've got a bunch of 13%. So we have density, building height, and land use all together, which are all critical components of how the character of the corridor meshes together. So thank you for those insights. That helps us to understand where you're thinking too. So let me stop sharing that, move on to this last section of the presentation. And this last section has a few more Zoom polls. So you'll get a few rapid fire Zoom polls in this part. But we wanted to, in this last section, gather your input into defining a vision for North Main Street with some very specific items. So since one of the major components of our work is zoning recommendations based upon the community vision that we're helping to define with you all this evening, we are framing the discussion in this last section around the current zoning for North Main Street. So a lot of these slides will have a lot of information on them. It's just a reflection of what's in the zoning today. I don't plan to go through all of it in too much detail this evening, but a part of our work is reviewing the zoning in great detail relative to the vision and making recommendations about where those regulations should head. So again, we're looking at the General Business District GBD 3, General Business District GBD 2, and then there's also a overlay district in the North Main Street area called the Village Center Overlay. So I'll explain a little bit of the details around those three items. So this is one of those slides where I will not get into all the things that are on it, but just to give you a flavor of one of the things that zoning regulates, if you're not familiar with this local bylaw, is the use that can occur on a property. So you see the uses that are permitted by right, permitted as under special permit, and not permitted or prohibited in the GBD3 district. So these are among other regulations. And what you can see on screen for GBD3, I think what's notable in this case, as not permitted are retail and restaurant uses. Those popped out to me. There might be others that jump out to you here, but these are, again, details that we won't dwell on too much, but they're to basically set up a poll question for you all. And this is a little bit different set of use regulations for GBD2. There are some subtleties between the two districts. And you can take a brief look at what's permitted by right and under special permit and not permitted in GBD2, which is the more southern district of the two. I see a question, is industrial use a component in the North Main Street reinvestment renovation? I think that specific uses we're trying to gather in the next poll question, actually, about what people would like to see. What is the vision of that the community of Winchester has for North Main Street? That may or may not involve industrial uses, but if it does, then we can help the town figure out a way to seamlessly blend that use into the corridor. It may not be a part of the vision. I don't know. That's up to you all. So let's get into that then. This poll question is about those uses and asking, it doesn't have to match what we just saw in terms of zoning, but it's more about what you want to see in the corridor. Because as a part of our work here, if there are uses which are inconsistent with the town's vision, this will be a part of what we're doing, is recommending that some of those use regulations be changed. So this poll is, what uses would you like to see more on North Main Street? And then a second question, what uses would you like to see less of on Main Street? So what's more of, what's less of? And let me launch that poll now for you. So I will say a few things here to help us. And on these questions, we were a little bit limited, again, by the 10 options we have. So additionally, we'd invite you to type in the chat. If you say, if there are more uses that we haven't listed in the poll that you want to see, just type them in the chat, but just make sure to note if you'd like to be more of that use or less of that use. So you could say more - industrial based upon what Russell mentioned in the chat, if that's something you want to see more of or less of. So on your screen now, you should be able to be voting for a range of uses you might like to see more of. So we've listed a few different types of residential uses. We've listed some specific uses which showed up in the zoning uses, which we just saw briefly on the screen. Some business uses, some auto-oriented uses, as there are some on the corridor today. Outdoor spaces, smaller outdoor spaces to complement the Bellino Park, for example. And then almost, I think they are a mirror image of the same types of uses that those same uses could be something you'd like to see less of. So those are the other question in this 2-question poll. And feel free to add some in the chat if we haven't, we've certainly not covered the full universe of uses which you could want to see more of. So it looks like a little over half of you have responded now. So give it just another minute or two. We're up to almost 70%. So that was a big jump. All right, so final clicks, final answers. All right, I'm going to close the poll now. If you get cut off, you can certainly put it into the chat. Or if you think of more that you'd like. Share these results back to you and take a look myself. So in terms of what uses you would like to see more of on North Main Street, it looks like there are 3 major vote earning responses. The biggest was 79% mixed use with residential and business uses. So that would likely be a vertical mixing of uses with the residential uses above those other uses. And small outdoor spaces, to see more of that, and restaurants at 55% and 58% respectively on those last two. And retail stores looks like it's the next highest in multifamily dwelling units after retail stores. And then what you'd like to see less of on North Main Street, it looks like the biggest vote getter there was auto services, repair, and fuel, is how we phrased it. And that was 68%, followed by multifamily dwellings at 21%, personal services at 16%, and then it looks like there's a few at 11%, which include retail stores, mixed use with residential and businesses, and townhouses. So thank you for that. We will unpack all of that relative to the current patterns of the district, which we saw, and the zoning characteristics, which we also reviewed briefly. So let me stop sharing this. So as I transition to the next part here, I see a few questions in the chat. So how are small outdoor spaces funded? That can actually be a part of zoning. Sometimes you can, for maybe as an incentive for a more dense development or larger development, or some sort of incentive-based relationship, you could ask for a developer to carve out a portion of their property as a small parklet or outdoor space. And that sort of relationship can sometimes work out through the zoning or design guidelines. And then also, so that would be funded privately in some cases. In other cases, it could be funded as part of public realm improvements publicly. And then please define personal services. So those are small businesses, which are typically geared toward beauty services. So it'd be like barbers, salons, nail salons, personal services for accountants. Well, there's a little bit of fine line between personal services and professional services. So accountants might actually fall on the professional services side, but it's more related to services of the, self, of betterment of the body and things like that. All right, so let me move along. Another aspect of the zoning are the dimensional regulations. And the dimensional regulations regulate the size and character of development. You can see the two North Main Street characteristics shown here on this summary table from the zoning bylaw. So for example, the front yard must have a setback of 10 feet. The rear yard must have a setback of 15 feet. No minimum open space or green space is required. That goes to the question that we just mentioned from the chat. That could be a requirement, or it could be sort of an optional situation that's related to some sort of development incentive. But requirements of open space are not unheard of in zoning. And then it also defines the maximum building height as 3 stories or up to 45 feet. 3 stories and up to 45 feet, I should say. It can never exceed 3 stories. So based upon these dimensional regulations, we just have a few questions which relate to those characteristics for you to weigh in on. The first is, are the buildings set back from the street an appropriate distance? So that might be just the way the corridor feels to you today, or it could be those specific numbers we just referenced, whichever you feel like. And then the other is, what is an appropriate height range for buildings on North Main Street? So let me pull up and get your feedback on those. Okay, so those are launched. So the options for the setback are that the current setbacks are today are about right. The setbacks should be larger, meaning the buildings are farther from the street. Setbacks should be smaller, meaning the buildings should be closer to the street. And you have no opinion about the setbacks. In the height, it's more measured of stories. So do you think the most appropriate height is 1 to 2 story, 2 to 3 story, 3 to 4 story, 4 story or more, or you have no opinion about the height? And I see a couple comments or questions in the chat. So I'll just take those while you're filling in the poll. So one is there a universal street setback for aesthetic integrity, congruence, and value? I don't know if that's like a general urban design question. I would say that setbacks in general vary on the context and type of place, of course. I think in general, it's good to have building setbacks cluster within, a 5 or 10 foot range so that there is some consistency about the front yard and what's happening there or the relationship to the sidewalk. But there is some variation that typically occurs, but you don't want it to vary from like a 0 lot line building to a 50-foot front yard in general, just because that does start to create some pretty strong inconsistencies. But there are other districts where that sort of thing works. So it's all few and far between. It's kind of difficult to generalize that. But one of the things we will look at here is what are the setback beyond the zoning? What are the characteristics today in terms of how the buildings are positioned on the properties and how that relates to the setback figures? And there's another question. Or more of a comment, more concerned about the back setback to the residential area. The zoning does have a additional residential setback, which I think in our case, in these districts is defined as the same distance, 15 feet, but could be set as a greater distance. Though I'm not sure, given the configuration of many of these parcels, if that would be a good idea in terms of the potential for investment on the properties. If you make that setback from a budding residential district where there are smaller properties such as there are in this district, it can severely limit the ability to redevelop a property. So it depends on what the goals are for the district. If redevelopment is potentially a goal, then we might want to look out for that. Another comment, the building height should relate to setbacks. Yeah, there's a fair amount of sort of urban design work and studies about the proper relationships between heights and setbacks and what makes for a pleasant feeling place or corridor. All right, so all of my rambling based upon the chat questions has caused us to get 75% of the vote in. We'll close the poll. Show those results back to you all. So the leading answers are close for setbacks. So setbacks should be larger was the leading at 38%, followed closely thereafter by setbacks should be smaller, 35%, with the next highest being setbacks are about right. Maybe those two also balance out to tell us that setbacks are about right. And then the building height, 2 to 3 story looks to be the favorite at 57%, followed by 3 to 4 story at 22%. And it looks like, given the triangulation on those two, that the maximum height of 3 stories may be about the sweet spot of what people are telling us there. So I'll stop sharing that. Great, thank you for participating in all these questions. So there are also some, I won't dwell on these either, but just thought I would share them. Some additional notes about the dimensional regulations for the district, including some landscape requirements, different requirements for types of uses. Again, these are details that I don't want to dwell on, but on this one I do want to dwell a little bit. which is the density descriptions for the district. So the density in the zoning is also measured by the measure we used earlier, which is floor area ratio, FAR. And it's defined right now as a floor area ratio of 1.0. And that's a maximum for GBD2 and GBD3. There's a incentive increase up to 1.25 if affordable housing is included as a component of the development at a minimum of 15% of the dwelling units. So I think that's a good trade-off for the town in terms of providing a little bit more density for affordable housing. I'm not sure if that provision has been utilized in the past or not. That's something we can follow up on. But so density is 1.0, which, if you recall, is actually quite a bit lower. I mean, is quite a bit higher, that allowed FAR of 1.0 than what the typical density was on those parcels when we measured that in the diagram earlier. So let's touch on density then. Let me get my, oops, I lost my poll. Here we are. So the first question is about the density itself. What density is most appropriate on North Main Street? And then, should affordable housing be required to be included? Which it is not today. It is there as an incentivized through that density incentive, but is not required. So I'm launching the poll now. Oh, I've been corrected. So affordable housing is required today. Thank you for that clarification. Stand corrected on that. 10% for projects of 6 or more units. So the questions on the screen, what is an appropriate density on North Main Street? Less density than today, the same amount, more density than today, or even more than currently allowed? Or you have no opinion about the density? And then, should affordable housing be required to be included? Responses are no, yes for about 10% of new units, or yes, about 15% of new units. Or you have no opinion about that. And then also there's a question about design guidelines in this set, which is, what should design guidelines address on North Main Street? And you can choose multiple answers for that one. We get the position of the building and parking on the property, the overall scale of the building and its massing, building facade and features, roof slope and features, features as they relate to historic structures, streetscape and landscape features, parking design and features, or outdoor open space design and features, or other. And if you have an other, please write your thoughts in the chat. So we'd like to know specifically if there's something, an item which you'd love to see covered in design guidelines. That would be very helpful to know.
Josh, Hank did ask, can you give a couple examples currently on Main Street about scale of FAR equals one building?
Yes, I can, but it'd be easiest for me to refer to that diagram, which is back on a previous slide. Let me see if I can bring that up real quick. So it looks like we've got about 66% of the votes in currently. So if you keep going on that. Now we're up to 75%. Thank you. I'll just give it a couple more minutes while I look for this file to look at. Yeah, on the as you are moving north on Main Street from the Skillings Road intersection on the left, most of those initial properties within our study area are in the FAR 1.0 range, except for the funeral home, which is right there as well. But most of those, I would say, first half a dozen properties are of that type of density. All right, let me close this poll. Looks like all of you who are answered will have done so. And share the results briefly. We're almost there. This is, thank you all for participating so much in this meeting. So here are the results. Density on North Main Street. Looks like the leading response, 47%, was more density than today, which I think is promising given how all these pieces are starting to fit together potentially. And just as a side note, maybe editorial comment, I think density, if done well, is an easier way to get more economic sort of viable redevelopment into a property as compared to something like building height. It's less noticeable than a taller building as a more dense building. You don't necessarily walk around a district and say like, oh, that's a FAR of 1.5, or that's a FAR of 2, or that's 16 units per acre, that sort of thing. It's just not as easily recognizable metric, but it does help in terms of financial viability. Should affordable housing be required to be included? It looks like the leading answer there was yes. At 42% of you said 15% of new units, which would be a little bit of step up from the current requirement, as Brian clarified for me. And then another 22% said yes at about 10%, and another 22% said no. And then in terms of the design guideline characteristics, streetscape and landscape features are the leading response, 69%. So guiding new investments and development to contribute to a positive streetscape along the corridor is something it's 100% within the possibilities of design guidelines. And then overall building scale and massing is the second vote getter, which is also well within the purview of those types of guidance. And then outdoor open space and design and features follows that. All right, so that's all very helpful feedback as to guide where we head with this work. We have just a couple more things to cover here, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. The last is, or one of the last things is parking requirements. And you can see those on the screen, and these are measured by use and fall within each zoning district. So there might be some variation from zoning district to zoning district, but if it's a residential use, it's typically 2 spaces per dwelling unit. There's variation in the amount of square feet per parking space required for a variety of commercial or institutional type of uses. And you can see some of that variation on the screen now with the differences between retail stores of different sizes, or personal services, or restaurants are measured by seat. So not to get into the nitty gritty of how many exactly are required per each different type of use, but more generally, what is an appropriate amount of parking to require on North Main Street? And this is measured more as what's currently provided. So how do you feel about parking that's currently on North Main Street? Should more parking than is currently provided be provided? The same amount? Less parking? Should there be no minimum in terms of how much parking is required? Or do you have no opinion about parking requirements? Just as I'll use this moment also to give some editorial comments and a little bit of insight into where planning thinking is these days. And some, not everywhere, but it's becoming more common that communities are considering reconsidering parking minimums, and that parking is not the best use of land. Of course, parking is needed, particularly in more suburban communities such as Winchester. You do have some transit access, but it's not the case that you can do everything without a car. But some places are noticing that parking is not free, of course, and parking has costs both for development and reinvestment in properties. And so requiring an absolute minimum may not be the right decision in all cases. But that's also not where every community wants to go. Yes, and as a comment just pointed out too, it certainly does depend on the use, the proximity to transit, the walkability of the place in general, and the surrounding destinations and mix of uses. So there's a wide range of considerations there. So it looks like we have 65% of the vote in. So we can just about close this one up. All right, I'm ending the poll now. Sharing those results back to you. So it looks like a little less determinant results on this one. Pretty even split between more parking than currently provided at 25%, the same amount of parking is currently provided at 25%, and less parking than currently provided at 25%. So whereas the shared voice in the room this evening might have given us a little firmer direction on some of these items, I would say the jury's out on this one potentially. So we'll explore parking as it relates to all of the sort of vision and ambitions as we start to articulate those for the district. All right, moving right along. I did mention earlier the Village Center Overlay District, and the intention of this overlay district was to enhance walkability and pedestrian orientation of the district. So it doesn't have too many differences. It does reduce the maximum front yard setback to encourage active pedestrian oriented uses and sort of frame the street edge and frontage of the properties. It does also provide some relief on the parking requirements, which also would improve potential for walkability. But this is a tool which could be used and potentially improved in the set of recommendations that come from this study. So I guess this is a softball question for you all, given some of the comments we've seen already this evening. But this last one is, would you be supportive of a safer walking and biking environment on North Main Street? So let me just pull that poll up for you. And the answers are yes, more improvements are needed, no, improvements are not necessary, or you have no opinion about walking and biking. So it looks like that one went very fast. So we have 75% of the votes in. So I'll close that now. All right. 79% agree with the walking. Okay. So with that, we'll pause here. And I know that we've covered a lot this evening, but wanted to provide an opportunity for any other questions or comments that people would like to provide, and we'll recognize you as you do any of the things that we've been describing. So use the raise your hand function, raise your hand in your video, or shoot us a chat, whatever the case may be. Yeah, and as Yolando pointed out, I think I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat and cover things, but we may have missed some things along the way. And so we will be saving the chat and integrating it with our meeting notes from this evening and all of the poll results, and compiling it with the direction we receive. And then eventually combining it with, hopefully we'll receive additional responses. So please do, and I'll give you some instructions for that in a moment, refer this presentation to your friends and neighbors, and then they can use the companion Qualtrics poll to follow up. So not seeing, oh, I do see one hand actually. Maureen, let's just recognize you. Here we go. Is that working, Maureen?
Okay, I'm now. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I just think it would be helpful for people to see what the reality is, where we are right now with North Main Street, and to know that how the zoning works at the where we are today. So this evening, after we close with this portion of the meeting, the planning board is having a regular public meeting. And in this public meeting, we are doing the reviews for a number of projects. And the first one will be a project on the Meineke site where there's a redevelopment project in front of us. Our board is not going to be granting the permit, but our board will be reviewing it. So if you just stay and go into the planning board meeting, you'll see exactly what's before us right now. And you'll should understand that right now, that same project will be going before the Design Review Committee and the Historical Commission. But in the end, the permit will be up to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So there's a process that I think people need to understand and to see what we're getting at the present. And you've also seen what the new construction looks like on North Main Street, right near the Bellino Park on the opposite side of the park. That's what is being delivered today under the current zoning bylaw. So the point being generally two things. First, for people to understand what the current zoning bylaw allows and what the process is. And then the second, to stay with us and join us as an open public meeting, join us in the planning board meeting that is to continue at 8:30.
Very quickly, sorry, Josh, I just want to point out, I just put it in the chat that it is actually under a different Zoom. So in terms of just staying, you actually won't be able to just stay. But I did put the Zoom link in the chat, and it's the Zoom link that's on our public notice for our meeting.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Maureen, for that context and those comments from the planning board. So with that in mind, I will, and not seeing any other hands presently, I will just close us out with a brief description of, oh, it looks like Sherry, before we move on, one last comment. Notice unmute you. There you go.
Yeah, I just realized one of the questions I hoped you were going to ask us, which didn't, and Maureen's response made me think of it, was who should be the permitting authority along North Main Street? And my personal opinion is that I think it needs to get out of the Zoning Board of Appeals, but it would be nice to have that sort of a question to the community.
Yeah, that's a great comment. We do have, as mentioned, a two-part series here with our community outreach and I think in the second meeting, we'll be getting into some of the more detailed recommendations potentially in that session, but this was more of a general opening about what people want to see on the corridor and shying away from specific administrative type changes or those suggestions. But no, I totally appreciate it. That's a very important point, and completely relevant to what all the dynamics that are occurring. All right, so one last call, I guess, for other questions of the last minute hand to pop up. Okay. Just in terms of this study, as I did mention, we will have a community meeting, a second one at the end of April or May. So please do watch out for that. It'll be posted on the town calendar and town website. Once that meeting is set, the date isn't currently known for us yet. We'll get that determined. But that we'll get into some of the more of the details as were just mentioned. There is an online survey with the link on the screen that mapz.az1qualtrics.com is a companion survey to what you've just experienced this evening that people can take online on their own time. So if you know of a neighbor, anyone, a business owner, property owner that wasn't able to join us this evening, we would love for you to send them towards this recording, send them that notice. Yolando has put it in the chat for you to grab. Then we'll also be advancing our analyses and analysis of the zoning specifically and continuing with stakeholder interviews. So that's the other plug to mention again is if you'd like to be interviewed or if you know of someone that should be, please do let us know the person's name and contact information, and we'll reach out to them and make sure that we understand all the perspectives that we need to in this process. So with that, looks like we're just about at exactly 8:30, and I give you all a hearty thank you for your participation this evening and your feedback and your thoughtful consideration of where North Main Street should be headed. We really appreciate that. So on behalf of Yolando and myself and Brian and the planning board and all the others in the town, thank you so much for participating.
Just very quickly, I wanted to say again, thank you to the 50 people or so that have been giving comments, and thank you so much to Josh and Yolanda for a very well-run meeting.
Yes, thank you very much, Josh, for all your work you did for this. The planning board will be moving to our next meeting in about 1 minute, but I wanted to thank you and everyone from MAPC for putting this together and for making it such an active event. I know a lot of people are more new to these surveys on Zoom, but it seemed to work really well and provide us some really good information. The planning board will be moving over to our next Zoom and continuing. And as discussed, we have a bunch of ZBA special permits that we'll be reviewing. One is actually in this area as noted, and a couple of A&Rs, and that is what's on our agenda. So if you'd like to join us, please continue onward to our next Zoom, and thank you. Thank you so much, MAPC. We look forward to all the work that you have before you on this and the continuation of it. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good night.